My sighting of these giants happened back in 1996 when my unit was sent on a secret mission to the Hindu Kush Mountains of Afghanistan. The purpose of our mission is irrelevant, but it has been declassified now, so I do have permission to tell you. We took off from Bagram Air Base just before dawn with another special ops team that were all Navy SEALs. They were flying on their own special ops chopper, while we flew in a Chinook helicopter, supplied solely by the Army. We had to fly over some fairly high mountains to get into the valley that was our original destination. It was still dark at this time, so it wasn't until we got almost halfway through these mountains when I saw something strange ahead of us. There was a huge bright light flying through the air towards us. I couldn't tell if it was another chopper by the way it was flying, at least at this distance. No aircraft lights were visible, so I knew it wasn't one of ours either. Even stranger was that this object didn't have any sound coming from it as it approached us and came closer. It was a dull gray color and looked very strange as it seemed to glow, almost. I remember being curious about what this could be. I did not have a radio on me, so I could not say anything to my co-pilot or the other chopper pilot. If this had been a movie, you'd probably think I should have gotten out a rifle and shot it from the sky, but for some strange reason, I just didn't feel scared. I believe it was one of the SEALs who finally yelled over the radio to asking us if we could see what this thing was. Right after he did so, both choppers came very close together. We were flying through a mountain pass. In that instant, I saw a giant humanoid figure down in a ravine in the mountains. Several of these figures, actually. There appeared to be about 3 of them. I'd say roughly 9 to 10 meters tall, red wild hair, and held primitive-like makeshift spear weapons. I only got a few seconds to look, but I know what I saw. The SEALs were laughing all over the radio when we realized both choppers had almost come together. After that, I was terrified. My imagination ran wild thinking about these giants that had terrified me with their appearance. I have never imagined anything like that in my life to what I saw this day. I don't know what to think about it. I was later on instructed about what I saw to keep my mouth shut, so I did. The way my superiors instructed me to do so was, we simply don't talk about those things, period. And that was the end of that. I know this sounds weird, but about a week or so ago, before this happened, I had a good buddy of mine who was also a motorcyclist who reported seeing strange things throughout this long stretch of road. He would often drive this area in the evening time and report feelings of being watched. I gave him a pretty hard time about it, thinking he was just being crazy until I had my very own experience when one evening, after midnight, I was riding through here by myself. This has happened to me twice now. I'm not sure if this is the same being, but there are some details that seem to be similar enough for me to conclude that these are related encounters. It was Thursday evening on June of 1994. I was already a veteran here, having served in Desert Storm in 91 to 92. I was riding my motorcycle home from work around midnight that night. It was about a mile or so, approximately, right out of Appomattox, Virginia, and I noticed something strange. I often came home late enough where it was dark and encountered headlights on the road coming towards me, but tonight, it seemed like there were none. Since this road is very heavily traveled, there are no crossroads. There should have been no cars out here at this time. As I pulled up to the crest of a hill and started to descend, approximately 300 to 400 feet from the crest, I saw something that nearly made me soil myself. I don't know how else to describe what I was seeing, except that it looked like a giant, upright, walking ape, covered in hair, running along the road, with its arms pumping furiously as it ran after my motorcycle. It kind of reminded me of a gorilla, running on all fours, but also standing upright every now and then to try and gain full speed. The most frightful thing about it were its eyes. They were glowing this white-yellow, and they almost seemed to glow in the dark, the same way headlights illuminate a deer's eyes. It's as if they possessed their own light source. Now, this thing ran after me for about a good 300 feet until I crested another hill. But when I looked back, it had vanished. It was almost as if the thing had just disappeared into thin air. In all honesty, it scared the crap out of me. And after thinking about it for a while now, I think this thing must have been traveling so fast, it was chasing after the light from my motorcycle. That is what probably caught its attention in the first place. But the strange part about it all is that not once did I hear any noise coming from whatever this thing was. Even though it looked like a large gorilla running on two legs, it never really made a sound. From what I saw from it, it was real ugly looking, like it was deformed or something, and even had horns, pulled back like a ram's horns are. It also had this nasty smell like a skunk. Believe me or not, this is one story I won't leave me alone until I get it off my chest. It sounds pretty stupid to some people when you try and explain what happened, but if anybody has heard of similar encounters along these lines, please let me know. I do not know what this being is or where it came from. If anybody has any insight onto what this thing was, let me know in the comments below. I am also aware there have been reports of strange creatures in this area, including Bigfoot sightings and strange otherworldly type encounters with UFOs and even other bizarre paranormal phenomena. But what in the world is going on around here? This stuff is scaring people, including me. I was deployed for over a year in Afghanistan. It was one of the most unique and terrifying experiences of my life. I was walking back to the base alone one night, deep in the night. Everything was silent for miles. In the desert night, you can really hear just about everything. There were no city lights in sight. The night was black, and the only illumination came from my flashlight, which cut a small beam through the darkness. The base, however, was well lit, so there was ample light to see the ground at my feet. I heard an unfamiliar noise off in the distance, which kind of reminded me of a woman screaming as I'm patrolling. I was a little concerned and took off my helmet, adjusted the volume of my radio. Just as I did this, these horrible, what I can describe as demonic screams started coming from all directions around me. Completely unsure of what to do, I made the decision to stay where I was until I could properly assess what was happening. After a few minutes, this large light materialized, about 45 meters into the air above me. It circled around me for a minute or two, with this horrible screaming sound coming from it. I kept my weapon aimed at the sky, waited to see if anything else would happen. It seemed to nearly pulsate in light and emit this loud noise. I began to think that this was some sort of cloaking device before dematerializing. Several other of the soldiers saw it too, but nobody could figure out what it was. When I got home, I told my wife about the situation, and she seemed to believe that I saw a UFO of some kind. I myself am not exactly sure, but it is something I cannot explain to this day. Also, I was in Iraq in 2010 and witnessed another strange thing. One night, around 3:30 a.m., I took up my guard position on the roof of a police station, and suddenly, this green light enveloped everything. It appeared that some sort of craft was flying over us, but nobody else saw it at the time. Apparently, I was the only one to notice this, and even when I talked about it with fellow soldiers, nobody seemed to understand what I was saying, like they were never present for it, even though they were only several yards away from me. While I was a Marine stationed at Quantico Marine Base, Virginia, I came back home from a 12-hour shift on base, very late at night. This was sometime after midnight. Being the only vehicle left in the parking lot for quite some time due to my shift, I parked closest to the building as possible, for fear of somebody breaking into it overnight. I was half asleep while walking around my car, inspecting it carefully to make sure that nobody had tampered with anything that may cause problems later on. Growing up in my teenage years, I've had my car broken into twice, and had somebody try to cut the brakes underneath my car. To say I'm paranoid is an understatement and very, what I would say, justifiable. With my keys already at hand, feeling around, looking for them, under dim light, coming from one of the building's windows, thinking about how much sleep I was going to get before work again tomorrow morning. I noticed something not being right with what I could only tell if I looked closer. A strange, hairy humanoid figure that was crouched down very low to the ground, causing me to literally freeze and dead in my tracks right before it sprung up like a coiled spring. It took off running with its back turned to me very fast, covering at least 30 yards in only a matter of seconds without tripping over anything it had to hurdle over. The only thing visible was its massive shoulder height next to a large tree trunk as it ran by, disappearing from sight behind a building. The hair on the creature looked coarse and blackish brown, or even dark gray maybe. Not sure why I thought though there were no other colors present. Its hair seemed matted down, flat against its skin, except for the shoulders, where they laid somewhere long just past them, standing straight up as if being held by water, or some type of oil, a slippery substance. It was so large that it really caught me off guard, and my best guess is if it was running by at least 30 to 40 miles an hour, if not faster. It stood on 2 feet, and its arms hung down to about its knees. I had read a story of somebody else who had seen something similar, but in another state. But I can remember word for word that he said, because it sounded almost identical, except the creature he saw apparently ran on all fours and grabbed a deer with its massive hands, throwing it over a high-voltage electrical fence. I can't say for certain that I saw the same thing, but it was definitely a huge hairy hominid. I think what's scary is who knows how long that thing had been there before I walked up, watching me. If the Marines weren't so strict on where you can and can't walk to within a half-mile radius of the base, then it would probably still be there. I encountered a creature on July 23, 2015, right around 10 p.m. I live in a small town called Penfield in Clearfield County, Pennsylvania. I was driving home from work on a Boy Scout road in Penfield, and I saw a large brownish tan creature crouching on the side of the road. It had a very large misshapen head, yellowish eyes, and a very long nose, kind of, dare I say, goblin-like. At this point, I slammed my foot into the gas pedal and did not let off the gas until I reached my home. I'm a very factual-based person, and I don't hold any personal beliefs as far as supernatural things are concerned. But since that night, I don't know what to think anymore. The reason I'm writing this is because I saw that thing back in November. See, I have a friend who is a sergeant. He claims to have seen a goat man back in the fall of last year as well. This is all the information I can really give you for now. If you need any more, please feel free to ask me. The first incident took place nearly 25 years ago now. I was stationed at Fort Bragg, North Carolina. Went camping with a friend of mine in the southern part of the Alligator River National Wildlife Refuge. This is an isolated area where you can only gain access by boat or four-wheel drive vehicle. We arrived at our destination around 8 p.m. on a Saturday evening. After setting up camp, we decided to do some fishing before it got dark. It would take about 15 minutes to get open water by boat, so we left the campsite, with 4 or 5 other guys who were also spending the night there. One member of our party noticed some tracks on the eastern shore of the river. We quickly got our flashlights and were amazed to see 15-inch long humanoid-like tracks in the sand. These tracks were only about 2 feet apart and ran straight down to the water's edge. The ground was soft and sandy, so we could very easily make out the shape of these prints. We didn't miss seeing the claw marks or other strange markings that would be associated with the hoax. I myself measured one track at around 17 inches long and 7 inches wide. The depth of these tracks indicated that something very heavy made them, and did not notice this approach. There is no way that these were made by a bear. They were too narrow for the front paws, and the space between each step was far too large. Our other companions, who were all military policemen, did not want to stay around very long, so we decided to follow the tracks upstream, against our gut instinct. After about 30 minutes, all of our flashlights died in unison, as if some electrical outage happened. We had replaced all the batteries prior to this trip, so we couldn't figure out why this happened. But it became very dark very quickly, and we began hearing strange sounds in the distance, kind of like heavy breathing. This went on for hours, and since nobody wanted to spend any more time there than necessary, we returned back to camp. I've always wondered what made those footprints. I believe this area is heavily populated with Sasquatches. And soon after this incident, I read an article about an upcoming Sasquatch hunt in this very area. One of the hunters who was interviewed claimed that he had seen 15-inch tracks about 1 month earlier on the Alligator River. Several other sources also mentioned seeing these huge footprints around the Fort Bragg area. Now, the second incident took place almost 3 years after, while attending college at Norfolk State University. My girlfriend and I at the time were working part-time for a private security firm. We had to monitor some abandoned buildings that were having issues with break-ins. The first few nights were pretty well, but by Saturday night, things had got really bad. We both kept hearing these loud screams all night, beyond in the woods, sounding like someone mixed a lion, a goat, and a wolf all in one, like a hybrid of some sort. It terrified us. Worse, it seemed to be coming from all directions. There was no way to track the sound. It would seem like it was coming from the north, then all of a sudden, the southeast. This went on for roughly 3 hours. We could hear there were multiples of them, whatever they were, but they weren't any normal animals I'd ever heard in my life. We've known other military servicemen who've also had some pretty bone-chilling experiences with these creatures in the area. It seems like this is a common occurrence here in the South. I know for a fact that something is awry out here in these woods. Sometimes even my own rifle don't make me feel safe. Normally, I'd never been a believer in or a sightee of any kind of cryptid or unknown creature. However, around 1986, I was stationed aboard the USS Tortuga, LST 1189, as a Navy Reserve officer. We had spent the day off the coast of Haiti, making sure that relief supplies were delivered to the Haitian people, who needed them very much after a hurricane had demolished their country. That night, our ship was underway on its way back to Jacksonville, Florida, where we were currently based. It was dusk, and the sky had gained considerable pinkish hues, and the sun was just starting to set in the sky. Myself and 2 other fellow lieutenants were standing on the open bridge, the wings of the ship watching Haiti fade on the horizon. As we looked over the port side of the ship, one of us 3 said he saw a flying creature. It was dark, so it really stood out against the pink sky. It was headed toward our ship, at least the direction from ahead of us into port. The first statement of any of us made was that it must be some kind of large bird. If you had seen the size of our propellers on the ship, you would know that a bird could get caught in it and be torn to pieces, assuming it was a large water bird that dove underneath the water. It kind of resembled a huge bat, though, the closer it got. Long pointed ears and a long tail. We were trying to figure out what kind of bird this was when we lost sight of it behind the mast of the ship. As it rounded the front of the bridge, we lost sight of it again. Then, as our eyes followed it beyond the bow, we saw that this creature was now flying alongside of us. Our claims at first were now countered by these around us, suggesting that perhaps it wasn't a bird. But now, those gathered on deck were laughing and pointing at the creature as it flew along with us. One statement I remember was that it has got to be a bird. But this thing kept flying, and we can now see its bright red eyes glaring down onto the deck of our ship. As any of you who have ever seen a bat up close, their eyes shine with an amazing red light which you can see coming out of them, even in the darkness. Now, being at night with no real background reference to compare its size with, we were all wondering what this could possibly be. We agreed that it wasn't a goose or a condor, but maybe a pelican, although I have never seen a pelican that resembled a bat. We witnessed it flying alongside of us for about 5 minutes. Then it began to glide away from the ship and across the horizon. The last we saw of it was a tiny dot on the horizon where its eyes had been glaring at us when it had glided over the water's surface. We never exactly figured out what it was, and none of us were ever believers in cryptids or strange creatures before this. I do feel that whatever we saw was some form of unknown species. Hi. First, a bit about me. I served in the Navy for 20 years as a military police officer. I am now retired after many years in the security industry. The following incident happened to me about 5 weeks ago whilst on holiday at my mum's farm, which is situated in southern Scotland. It was around 5 p.m. and the sun had just set. It was getting dark quite quickly. I was walking up to my vehicle, parked at the side of her house where she lives with her partner, when my attention was drawn towards one of my mum's field by some odd-appearing lights, which were kind of hovering above in the sky. These lights were glowing bright white, but they appeared to be descending slowly, almost as if they were dropping down into the field. As I got closer, the lights became apparent that there were actually now 2 white lights, both of which were the same size, but now one was beginning to get larger than the other. I crept closer, getting about 50 yards within these lights, and the large white light began to move towards me at a slow pace and then almost hovering above me before disappearing. It appeared to be at least as big as a house, maybe bigger if anything. There were no visible features on this object whatsoever, just 2 bright white lights which appeared to be projecting downwards. The smaller medium-sized light remained in the field below it for another few minutes until it too headed off in the distance, where I lost sight of it completely. The larger light then re-emerged before disappearing again back into thin air after leaving this tiny blur trace behind it. The only thing that's strange that I've dealt with while on Scottish soil. When I was younger, I also dealt with something of a beast in the Scottish woods. The incident happened when I was out walking in the woods with my family. We were all enjoying our walk when it started to get dark, so we turned around and headed back towards home. It wasn't long before I noticed something following us, but at first, I didn't think too much of it, being naive about such phenomenons. But then this thing began to run through the trees, keeping pace beside me, alongside my family. Knowing that something was wrong, I quickly shouted for everybody to run ahead, while trying not to lose sight of them at the same time. The creature moved faster, though despite its size, even faster than myself, which is surprising due to the amount of times I've served in combat zones, abroad where adrenaline can be flowing through your body constantly. No matter how fast I ran, I can never gain ground on it, and what's more is that the deeper we went into the woods, this thing just seemed to be getting bigger too. When we reached a clearing, I quickly hid behind some shrubs, trying not to let this beast see me as my family escaped. It continued to grow in size until there was no mistaking its identity. It looked like a mutated bear, carved out of stone almost, with large ears which were almost elven in shape, and a much more elongated head, 2 horns protruding from its forehead, and 9 eyes, like some freakish arachnid. It was terrifying. I also spotted another smaller creature looking around it as well. It wasn't as big, but it looked just as striking. Not a sound did either of these things make. This was one of the most unnerving things of all. The creatures saw one another and headed off into the distance, I think still looking for me and the family, although I'm not too sure. To this day, I cannot explain what these things were, only that they were definitely not from this world. Far more terrifying than anything that I've ever seen while serving. I will say that if it wasn't for my training, I probably wouldn't be alive today. I can tell you the exact year and month this happened. It was in 1979, in April, that my own battalion received orders to ship out for the USMC Recruit Depot in San Diego, California. I was in weapons company of the 2nd Battalion, 9th Marines at Camp Lejeune in Jacksonville, North Carolina. After my basic training in Parris Island, South Carolina, and infantry training at Camp Geiger, I had become a rifleman assigned to 3rd Platoon of the Lima Company. When we left for San Diego, it took a day and a half by train to get there, most of us having never been outside the California's borders before, so this was an adventure. Once arriving in California at MCRD, I had my first taste of real fighting from some Marine Corps drill instructors. Once I made it through the MCRD hell, I shipped out to Camp Pendleton for further training before being assigned a unit. That is when I met Mr. Bill. What is strange about this story is my past experience with large flying creatures had me slightly prepared for what was coming next. I have never ever read or seen any type of large flying reptilian creature in any science fiction movie or story. But I have read about and seen a pterodactyl one time before. This was during my high school years, when I went on a field trip with a bunch of classmates to the local museum. In the huge atrium, there was a very old mounted wingless pterodactyl on display. I think it had been there for at least 20 years, maybe more, before I saw it. The thing was sitting upright, on its tail. Wings were spread out to the sides of its body like some type of prehistoric leathery aircraft. It looked like something off of a low-budget science fiction film, set or prop. It really gave me the heebie-jeebies, because here was this monster that had lived and died during prehistoric times. It was scary just looking at it. So, of all that, made my first experience with Mr. Bill's little baby pterodactyl less than disturbing to me than it might have been to somebody else who had never saw something like that before. All Marines in my battalion had been seeing these things too. I know, because they resembled somewhat of the pterodactyl that I saw with Mr. Bill. Sometimes you'd see them flying around during dusk, off in the far distance. Other times, they'd be higher up towards the mountains, but they were unmistakable to see. But more on that in a minute. Back to my story about the Marine Corps recruit depot. It was around the first week of May when myself and a bunch of fellow Marines were on parade ground, more or less waiting for something or other. We were all lined up at attention, not moving much at all, except for some shifting. And just then, I happened to glance in the direction of a very distant mountain, about a mile or two away, and there in the air, high above something, caught my attention. I figured it was a bird, but it was so large. But when it made a big, lazy U-turn and came back in our direction, I could not believe what my eyes had saw. The thing was huge, a large winged reptile, but you could see that it looked nothing like a bird due to its size alone. The wingspan was 3 times the normal size of a condor. I looked around to see if anybody else saw what I was seeing, but everybody's eyes were straight down in the position of attention, so they could not have been looking anywhere else except for ahead towards the drill instructor up on his little platform. It was then that I figured out the only reason why the DI had not said anything about the giant flying thing in the sky was that he probably saw it too. I just happened to look up in its direction, and it had come back around, headed into our general direction again, coming from behind a very tall barrack building. It came closer until it passed overhead, right above, where we were all standing at attention on the parade grounds. I could see it all very clearly. It was a huge creature with bat-like wings and a long skinny tail. The whole encounter could not have lasted for more than a few seconds, but it flew off towards the mountains again. And I'll never forget the direction and the general outline of what I had seen, and how it looked nothing like any type of bird at all that I've ever seen in my life. This was the very first time all of us saw one. Even the locals and natives there recognized them and even talk about them. If there's ever a place that Jurassic Park exists, it's there, in Papua New Guinea. My name is Rick, but you can call me Terrace. That was, after all, my nickname in Iraq. I had a few buddies who called me that. I guess it's like some kind of slang. War is hell. But over there, they play by a different set of rules. Anyway, I was in the military for about 8 years, and since then, have worked as some kind of private contractor for the last 5. I don't know if I should be telling you this story, but anyway, even if your website says anonymous, you never know how safe things are nowadays with all the cybercrime and cyber-terrorism going on. It didn't take long after getting off duty to head out towards home, which is just outside of town near this farm that my parents used to own, long before they passed. It's not much, just a little place where I store food now and keep my own personal things. But in a way, it is home to me. Feels good to get out of the country, after being in that desert for so long. It was already dark when I got off the road about 10 miles from home, maybe thanks to all those darn clouds blocking out any of that beautiful moonlight. So I figured with the darkness setting in very fast, no sense in wasting time. I got out my Magnum flashlight and continued on foot across the bumpy gravel path towards the farm buildings ahead of me, which were now barely visible in this thick black darkness. It made my way past some trees and overgrown vegetation lining the road, until I came upon an old pathway that leads to the backside of my parents' old farmhouse. Earlier in the day, I couldn't help but notice that this pathway looked like it had been trampled over by something large, so decided to come out here and investigate what was going on. It didn't take long to see where these large tracks were being made across this part of the farmland. The grass was already flattened down by something very heavy walking back and forth through here multiple times, just short of the summer season. It wasn't hard to me to figure out whatever caused these prints in the ground was probably pretty big, easily 9 or 10 feet tall if not more, given how wide apart each set of footprints were, apart from each other. So I came upon a small clearing and stopped, shone my flashlight just ahead of me, and I heard an awful sound that still haunts me to this day. A blood-curdling howl followed by a hissing, crackling and rumbling, immediately making the hairs on the back of my arms stand up in fear. I've done some bad things in Iraq, but nothing like what was going on right in front of me. At first sight, my flashlight beam only lit up part of it before its eyes. It was large and black-looking before standing fully upright. Its wide shoulders and massive chest were, from what I could tell seeing, covered in a reddish-brown fur. It was hunched over as it looked through the tall grass, partially hiding it. At first, I assumed maybe it was some kind of bear, but as my light hit its eyes, they glowed this bright orange amber. It was like two hot glowing coals bathed in crimson anger. Short for a Bigfoot, but no more than 6 feet tall, if I had to guess. All that muscle definition everywhere you looked on its body. What kind of species this thing belonged to eluded me. Other than knowing whatever it actually was, it wasn't human-friendly. I stood there, frozen with terror, staring right back at this creature whose size alone would have easily outweighed me by over 100 pounds, if not more. The jaws on this thing were large and black, opening up so wide I could now see down its throat, as it let out this other unholy howl that made the ground shake underneath our feet. This must be what a deer feels like when looking into an approaching freight train that's about to run it over. The only thing we had between us was an open field and darkness surrounding us, both during this tense moment of fear and trepidation. The creature wasn't moving towards me at first, for some reason. I knew that engaging with it would have resulted in a death sentence, so simply, I retracted. After the initial shock wore off, I slowly backed away from this thing, while keeping my light pointing right at it. It continued to just stand there, seeming to be just as afraid of me as I was of it, or so it acted that way. Why did it come into the clearing in the first place? We kind of just stood there having a face-off for what felt like an eternity before I made a mistake that probably would have sealed my fate. In order to back away from this thing, who did not advance towards me but rather stayed where it was, I had no choice but to turn around and run back across the field. Now, I want to say this because it's important. Never, and I mean never, do you turn your back and run from a large predator, especially one like this that's unknown. You just don't do it. It entices them to chase you. That's exactly what happened, and I was not even armed when this happened either. I was about halfway across the clearing when I heard it coming after me before jumping down and disappearing into the brush, just mere feet away from me. I don't care if you don't believe. You don't have to. I'm telling you the terror of that night is real, and what I endured is real. I had more than enough time to take a good look at this creature, and would most certainly remember what it looked like. I will never forget that face as long as I live. With those eyes staring into my very soul with pure hatred, it's forever embedded into my memory. I have no idea how fast this thing could have chased me down, but I know it would have made a meal out of me if given the chance. As soon as I cleared the trees and got back to around my house, I ran inside, locked every door and window before going up to my bedroom, which was on the second floor of the house with a balcony outside facing where I'd just come from. I didn't sleep the entire evening, but the following morning, I actually insisted on staying at a hotel for that time being. Too many strange things were going on around the property, and I wasn't going to take any chances of being mauled to death by some monster. Whether this was a Bigfoot or Dogman or whatever, they are real. The next day after what just happened, I finished paying up at the hotel, which had its own little restaurant connected to it, providing pretty good food. So the front desk person wanted to talk to me about what happened last night, after I kind of gave him a little bit of info on me and what I went through. They told me something very interesting about my ordeal that made me feel more uneasy all over again. He said the hunters who use the fields behind the house and around have seen these large black dogs out there, the largest wolves they've ever seen before, but only during deer hunts, which is the only time of the year that deer are in the area. Can you believe that? I never knew there were wolves here, but the more I thought about it, the more sense it made. These are large unknown canids, and I don't want anything to do with it. Not my story, but my grandfather's actually, who served during Vietnam. Now, he's never been one to really share his stories and things with anyone, but he will sometimes. He recently, just in the last couple of years, noticed that I took a liking to cryptozoology and things of that realm. After learning that it's even a thing, he began to tell me how during the Vietnam War, which again he served in, a part of the platoon he was in was attacked by these large, 10-foot-tall reptilian crocodilian creatures. They killed at least 8 of his men. His story terrified me when he told me it, and so I'll share it with you. He said that his platoon had been in a long and grueling march through the jungle. They were really close to where they were going, but had one more obstacle to go through. A river that would take half a day at least to cross with all their gear. They were already in the midst of a very thick part of the jungle, and with their current location, it would be tougher. So they waited for nightfall before crossing. There were Viet Cong soldiers in the area, and they wanted to wait for them to pass. Everybody except for the point man who had went ahead of the group to scout out the crossing. He said that after about an hour or so he returned with wild, terrified eyes, asked if they could get across without making too much noise, due to there was something large in the river. Well, my grandfather said they did their best, but it was still quite noisy when they got in the water. He heard this strange, almost trumpet-like noise he described in the distance. It sounded like it was coming from the direction of the river. At first, they thought it might be maybe a kind of animal or something, but after a few seconds, it became clear that there were too many weird things about these noises that did not pinpoint back to any animal, so they simply kept moving. By the time they got to about the halfway point, night had fallen, and because of this, my grandfather said he only saw one dark shape in the river when he made its way under them that disappeared after about a second or two. He said that besides that one, in that one moment, nothing too much seemed out of the ordinary besides the noises, but you could tell everybody was very uneasy. Once everybody got across the river and onto land again, his point man set up to keep watch for a few moments while everybody else tried to get a bit of sleep. He claims that 5 minutes into the guard shift, nothing seemed wrong at all, but then saw 2 or 3 of these dark shapes in the water that began to ascend out of the water. Quick note, this section that they were in was a very thick part of the jungle, he told me. Even the captured Vietnamese refused to travel through here, and when questioned, they acted very scared. They knew. Anyway, he said that the first thing he did was wake everybody up, and for some reason, his point man wouldn't respond. After a second of shock, he realized this as well, as the fact that their point man was no longer on post, but had now been dragged into the water. My grandfather said at this point, everybody began to panic. Some went for their guns, and others tried to get a better look at whatever was in the river. It wasn't long before they realized that this thing had killed off half their men, including their point man, taken in their sleep. He said there were 3 or 4 of these creatures in the water, coming out and going back in. Everybody started shooting at them, but it didn't do much other than make things worse. At first, they thought it was just because there were so many men shooting, and then he noticed that some of the bullets would go through one of these creatures, and after a second or two, another creature on the same side as the other one would rise up out of the water and eat what was left of the comrade on shore. He said everybody tried to run away at this point, but some didn't make it back into the jungle in time before watching everything they had ever had become eaten by these things. They went into hiding for hours until dawn finally came around. Apparently, during this time, he wasn't sure if he was awake or dreaming, when more than once he heard screams sound off in the distance. He knew those were his teammates being eaten and torn alive. He told me that none of this seemed real if he closed his eyes, but when in the daylight, it was a different story. He told me that in a few short hours, they finally heard a chopper in the distance and began to signal them with their gun mags. He said that when they got to where my grandfather and some of his friends were at, they were all left. There was just bones and bits of meat and flesh from these creatures. He told me he never returned to that part of the jungle again, and making the shortcut was a huge mistake. He told me this story about 10 years ago. It still keeps me up at night, sometimes thinking about what happened. This is the only time my grandfather would ever talk about running into large humanoid crocodilian creatures. And no, these weren't just regular crocodiles. These were something out of a nightmare. They had a taste for human flesh. Back in the 1980s, I was stationed in Prague, Czechoslovakia, within the US military. I came home to visit my family for Christmas, and while at their house, me and my stepfather got into a heated argument about politics of all things. At one point, he said something that really pissed me off so much, I decided not to stay any longer. It would only lead to trouble between us both. So, after spending some time with him, I walked out the door on him without giving any notice or saying goodbye to anybody else in my family. My wife was busy at work when this happened, so she did not have an opportunity to say goodbye either. This was around 4 p.m. in the evening. I began walking down the street where my car is parked, just a few blocks away. As I'm walking along, I hear this very loud whooshing sound directly overhead. At first, I thought it was maybe a helicopter as this thing had passed overhead, or at least oncoming, but it sounded nothing like one. The noise this thing reminded me of was what you'd hear like if you took a time-lapse recording from maybe an aircraft carrier or something similar. It sounded as though there were multiple engines within the object as well, due to the various levels of pressure coming from different directions, which kind of created an oscillating effect that shook everything below it, adding to this deafening sound the closer it came. In order for me to understand what this was, I ran as fast as I could to my car, threw it in reverse, and started speeding up to the street to get back onto the main highway. As I'm pulling out of the parking spot on that side of the street, I see it for the first time. This thing flies right across my windshield and overhead. My first thought was, oh no, because now that it's close up, I can see this thing has a distinct human form, and although its body seems elongated and muscular, like an athlete or something similar, it had wings on its arms which made me think of a bat but without fur or any feathery appendages. It also had legs with feet, so large that from the distance I saw it, I would have never believed it for real, had I not seen this with my own eyes. As this thing was flying overhead, it turned its head and looked right at me with a very menacing glare that totally said, "I see you." I'll never forget the feeling of being busted for doing something wrong by somebody old enough to be your father. That's what this thing felt like. And it had a long protruding snout, kind of like a beak or maybe an anteater or something similar, and very large orbish black eyes. Its skin and face was also very pale. When I drove off, I looked back to see where it went. The thing was gone, just like a ghost. I never knew they were in this area until after my encounter with them, but I read about similar sightings happening online. This really surprised me at the time. I'd never seen anything like it or even heard anybody else talk about them until now that I know about their existence. I'm talking about gargoyles. My unit and I were stationed at a training base in the Croatian National Forest. We were told that there had been sightings of this creature, and it was very dangerous. So we were on guard for anything really. One night, while driving with my navigator, I saw something very large go up in a tree about 100 to 150 yards from the road. My NCOIC also saw this and identified it as a cryptid. I didn't know what that was. I was too busy concentrating on driving in order to avoid hitting whatever it was. Because it happened so fast, I was convinced it was going to land right in the road. So I have no idea what kind of being it was. What we saw was a large, long, dark-furred creature leap from off a dirt road and into the middle of the road. It had been standing next to a tree just outside the woodline that runs parallel to this very desolate stretch of rural highway. It quickly leaps out of view from the road, off into the tree line, disappearing for good at that point. I was just a young soldier at the time. It is the only cryptid sighting of my entire life. It had been a clear night with rain earlier that day, so visibility was good, even into the woods that were about 20 to 50 yards from each side of this two-lane road. We stopped and got out to take a look around, but with no flashlight. We had no real idea of what direction to walk. To be honest, I was too freaked out to go into the woods for a closer look myself. We both said that whatever it was must have moved through very quickly and back off into the darkness. We did not hear anything past our own hearts racing at this point. I've been in the Army now for 23 years, and not much phases me anymore. The one thing that will always stick out in my mind was this encounter. I am a believer of UFOs, but when it comes to cryptids, such as Bigfoot or whatever it was, if it leaves tracks you can find them, then I'm more than willing to believe it exists. Here's another story. I was at Fort Bragg. It was about 1 a.m. I was sitting on the ground outside, waiting for a security checkpoint to clear, when I heard something crashing through the trees just over my shoulder towards my right side. If you imagine yourself in that situation, then you have a good example of how I felt. I heard this crashing through the woods sound not more than 20 feet behind me, but there was nothing to be seen other than the trees shaking like crazy. When I turned around and looked, I saw something brown about the size of a small bear covered in fur, with black hair all over its face. It kind of had a long tail, and pointy ears, and no hair on the very top of its face. I would say it was maybe no more than 200 pounds. I began to get very scared and started to pull out my pistol, when this thing turned and saw me, ran back into the woods, and was now gone. I felt like it wasn't going to hurt anybody, and that I was safe, but if you saw this thing, you would understand why I started reaching for my pistol. The whole encounter maybe lasted 5 to 10 seconds at most. I found this old report, and I thought you would find it of interest. The lieutenant is anonymous, but his sighting is horrible sounding. At 04:15 on the morning of July 18th, 1944, while acting as the officer in tactical command of a 9-ship anti-submarine task force, stationed about 200 miles east of Yokosuka, Japan, I witnessed an incredible encounter with what I believe to be a large sea monster, or giant octopi. A destroyer on our starboard side began firing at what was estimated to be about a 70-foot-long creature, about 2,000 yards away from our ship. The destroyer's gunner reported that the monster suddenly dove at the destroyer, stove in its bow with one sweep off its massive tentacles, and submerged again. When it resurfaced shortly thereafter, moving out ahead of the destroyer, it turned at right angles and caused the ship to list 30 degrees. At that point, the destroyer ceased firing for fear of striking our own ship. I at once directed another destroyer, which was on our port side, to fire within its 5-inch guns on the monster, having no effect other than further damage to the superstructure of our sister ship. The attacking monster submerged and appeared to be moving away from the starboard side of our ship. When it resurfaced on our port side, I turned my ship directly toward the monster's position, opened fire with all battery weapons, including 5-inch guns, 40mm anti-aircraft guns, 20 millicaliber machine guns, and finally 4-inch rockets, which were the only weapons available which had a chance of a hit. The rockets were fired in pairs from each turret, and when they struck the water, I observed with my own eyes that they skipped like flat stones skimming across water. One pair of rockets struck the monster's head, which at once disappeared beneath the waves. A second later, 2 more pairs struck the water, where it had just submerged. and I saw large columns of reddish-brown liquid rise to about 50 feet in the air, followed by an explosion which made the ship tremble just slightly. The attacking monster was never seen again. I've been in the military since I was 18. I'm now 67 years old. In my younger days, I was blessed to have been from a family of hunters and outdoorsmen, so I've always been around guns, dogs, and coon hunting. In the early 1960s, when I was still a kid, we lived outside a small town on a large farm. This had been in our family for over 100 years. It was 1968. We were working on our coon dogs. We would take about 15 or so, have them out on a run for breeding purposes. There was myself and another fella who had been together for about 5 years or more. We knew each other real well. The way I figure it, the only reason the dogs saw what they did is that we were upwind of whatever it was, and the dogs somehow smelt it and went and stood their ground looking, standing their ground until this thing came upon us. It must have been about 5:30 in the evening, I reckon. The sun was going down, but we had plenty enough light to see what we were doing. We'd run these critters pretty hard. We were out in the country where there was nobody around for miles, except an occasional farmer. We didn't see anybody else that day. It had started raining about noon and continued to rain through the afternoon. A real cold, windy December type of day, until about 5:30 or 6 when it quit raining. We were getting ready to turn the dogs back in when we started hearing them bark and growl, and they took off out in the woods. They went in a big circle, came running back in our direction, which was now upwind of whatever it was that scared them. They ran right by us and headed home through the fields. I've never seen them run the way they did that day. They were scared and running for all they were worth. We both got a good look at the thing when it stepped out of the woods. Not more than 30 to 40 feet away from us. At first, we saw just its head sticking above the grass in a small little clearing. We watched it for a minute or so, and then all of a sudden, it rose up from where it was standing and began running on 2 legs. It ran right into the field about 50 feet from us. It had black fur that was very coarse looking, even for this time of year. It was kind of like fur on a bear, but it stood up on 2 legs, just like you and I do. The face was very wide, eyes that were kind of glowing and pulsating white. It had very long arms, not quite as long as an ape's, but they hung right by its chest. And the hands only had 3 fingers, no thumbs that I could see. The fingers resembled more claws. We were both looking at this thing with our mouths hanging open. It took off running, headed right for the edge of a big 10-foot deep cut bank along the road. When it got to that cut bank, it never hesitated once. It ran right up the side of that bluff, about 6 feet or so, then just disappeared. The head and eyes were what we saw first. We knew we were looking at something real, but the rest of the body took some time to develop. It was down in a low spot. When it stood up and started running, that's when we realized exactly what it was. There wasn't any doubt in our minds. Although, I don't know what it was. Whether it was an ape or something. I've heard stories about werewolves before, but that thing wasn't a wolf. It didn't walk like one, nor did it look like one to me either. Whatever that was scared the heck out of us. We didn't even have any reason to be scared. It never made a sound. It never growled or spoke or said one word. It didn't even appear to try and want to harm us. It just ran off, like I said, right up the side of that bank, maybe 15 feet high, without so much as looking back once at us. The only reason I'm telling you this story is because whatever it was came right back down off that bluff and got one of them hounds. The rest of them hounds caught up with it about 2 miles. We didn't find the dog until the next day, about 10 miles south of where we stood and watched it run off. It was a good hunting dog, one of the best I'd ever had, and here is where an exceptionally cold winter night of negative 25 degrees below zero, maybe worse than that. The weather had broke and we were hunting raccoons in the woods when we ventured onto some open ground and ran into whatever it was that had the hound. The dog was dragging itself, its back broken in 3 places, and didn't have a mark on it, except where his back was broke. The tracks left by whatever got him were unlike anything I've ever seen before. They weren't human tracks. They were too big for that. But they weren't no animal tracks either. They were bigger. That's about all I can tell you. I don't know what it was we saw that day, but whatever it was really scared us and ran off with the fine hound dog. Something I've never seen before or since. I just wanted to tell you all that before something bad happened to you out there in the woods. I know most of what I've seen over the years has been pretty real, but with some of them, when the weather's bad or when it's dark outside, I can't say for sure really that they're there unless I see them again. These bipedal canine monster stories. In 1999, I lived in Edinburgh, Indiana. Myself and wife were living about 3 miles south of the old Camp Atterbury military base. This was decommissioned shortly after World War II had ended. I worked midnights at a local factory that had one-day shift persons. This night, my wife woke me up, saying she heard some loud banging sounds early in the morning, but was not sure what it was. She thought that she had heard a voice too, but wasn't sure. I know for a fact there were no animals or people walking around because it was so early in the morning. The alarm would have gone off if anybody had tried to enter the factory during those times. So I stayed up until about 5:30 a.m., then went to bed. I was talking about it later that day with 2 coworkers at the time. Many of the Indy 500s were being built around us by Camp Atterbury, so my guess is maybe some construction workers. Also in the mid-90s, there had been a lot of military drills happening, which included tanks or other armored vehicles being driven on and around the base. I have a second story, but it's more of a worker fiction, as it never happened to me personally, so I take it as such. In 1992 or so, my brother lived in Columbus, Indiana, and worked at Cummins as an engineer for over 20 years. Cummins is the engine powerhouse behind the diesel industry, and has been for decades. My brother would stay late many nights until the early morning working hours on test stand for engines. The building he was in was right next to their biggest test stand, which is used to overheat and stress all parts of a diesel before they are installed into a truck or other various locomotive. Cummins did not want any engine failures in the field. Cummins is located in Columbus, which is right across the Ohio River from Louisville, Kentucky. One night after midnight, my brother was working late when he heard a terrible noise coming from the test stand area. It sounded like an 18-wheeler diesel truck being pushed right outside a window. The stands are about 100 feet away and built like a bunker. He knew nobody else was there. He locked the door behind him like always. The only way to get in is if somebody buzzes you in, which was done by my brother at night, or hold your badge up next to the reader mounted on the wall, next to any locked doors. So anyway, he gets terrified, calling security. When they come, he describes what he had heard and what was happening outside his window, which should be impossible. The only people there should be him and 2 other night shift workers who locked up. They left like normal before my brother came into work that evening. The security guys investigate the test stand area within their flashlights to see if there's any break-ins. No one. Absolutely nobody is anywhere near the test stand area. But the noise continued like somebody was banging on metal parts loudly for hours. The Cummins security guys said they were going to investigate this further, and got many weird calls down at the desk that same night about noises coming from that building after midnight. My brother got out of there and went home. Cummins was very well known to have had a lot of strange happenings go on in their test stand building for decades. Cummins security would investigate every time something happened, but nothing was ever found. Many guys who worked there just refused to work late at night in that building. They were terrified of what was happening. I do not know if this story is true or not, but my brother would swear up and down on a stack of Bibles that it happened. He never believed in ghosts either, so what was he seeing them for? A friend who also lives in Columbus told me last year that the old test stand building had burned up in a fire, seeming suspicious. Forgive me, I'm an old fart, but I think you would appreciate my story back when I served in Vietnam in the Navy. I was just 19, a young buck. Our vessel was attacked by something, It came out of the water and tore the heck out of the ship. We never saw it coming. It was so fast. It took us several days to repair all the damage caused by this thing. The sound was deafening, like nothing I'd ever heard before. And we couldn't figure out at first what was making that kind of noise underwater when it was not a whale. In the following days, we kept a lookout for what happened. To start the story off, I was currently stationed off the coast of Vietnam, aboard the USS Storms, DD-780, which was an Allen M. Summer-class destroyer. During her 1967 deployment to Vietnam in the support of Operation Sea Dragon, our radar picked up on something on the surface. It looked like a small island just off the coast of northern Vietnam. We made our way over there and found a conical-shaped object sticking up out of the water, about 30 feet. We approached it cautiously at first, but slowed our approach after seeing no reaction from the small island, or whatever it was. It wasn't really a small island. I just call it that. The closer we got to this thing, the more unusual it became. To start with, there were obviously no trees on this island, which was only about 30 feet in diameter. It was all one big smooth cone-shaped mound. Then we noticed that the island seemed to be made out of this texture, not like rock. But what really caught our attention was when we got within several hundred yards and saw how much it began to move. The closer we got, the more it moved. We're about to continue on our way when one of my lookouts said he could hear something below the water. We all stood there quietly thinking nothing of it until my signalman called for me and said that whatever was making that noise seemed to be coming from the island. The closer we got to it, the louder it seemed. And then my other lookouts said they could hear something as well. Also, over the sound of our own engines, which were very, very loud. So, I took us in closer. We could maybe see what was making all that noise. It suddenly dawned on me that this island was not at all stationary. And you have to remember, at the distance we were at, it totally looked like an island. This thing had started to move. This was a living sea organism. As we were watching it slowly undulate, even as it spread open to the top like some kind of giant clam, we wanted to get away, but our engines seemed to be straining against something unseen. The more we tried to move away, the harder our engines seemed to work. We were stuck. We were looking around for what was anchoring us when we looked down and saw it. The closer it got, the more visible it became. It was like watching an image appear in a developing tank of a photographic paper. What looked like islands at first became long lines that were attached all the way around this thing. Then I could see what looked like flippers, similar to an elephant's ears, or so they reminded me. Even saw a face that looked somewhat kind of like a giant lizard, with great big eyes. I called my gunner over, told him to open fire on this thing if it tried coming up out of the water at us. I tried turning our searchlight on the thing, but the light just seemed to disappear into it. Whatever this thing was, it did not want to be seen. We were dealing with a colossal bioform. I remember our ship beginning to shake as if we hit something underwater. We all thought it was coming after us until we heard a huge sucking sound and felt like we were beginning to slide sideways. The creature had let loose of our keel and seemed to be sliding back deeper in the ocean. Once the thing was completely submerged again, our engines came back online and started pulling away from this thing faster than I ever thought possible. I could see something moving around on top of it as we sped away. Whatever it was now diving headfirst straight down. The more I looked, the bigger it seemed to get. Then it hit me. It was an eye. A huge round eye that looked like a big red bulb. Then it turned blue, the same way a bioluminescent fish changes colors. I remember turning to my lookouts, yelling for them to sound our horn loud enough to hopefully scare whatever this thing was away. I remember the sound of our ship's horn bellowing into the blackness at top volume, and I remember seeing this huge red eye appear on that thing, staring right at us before it finally sunk back down below the depths of the dark ocean. And there was this kind of flash of light, almost equivalent to a fireball going off underwater. like the creature had used some kind of secret weapon on us. It very much reminded me, the same way fish that have that bioluminescent gene in them will flash their colors, kind of as a distraction, or the way that deep-water squid will do the same thing. That's kind of what it was like, but just on a massive, colossal scale. I could see a trail of bubbles going up to the surface, which exploded upon hitting. The water began now boiling around us, and this giant red eye came back into view, seemingly glaring at us from deep below. We were lucky we weren't all killed. I had my men sound the horn again, and we sped away from this thing and placed as fast as we could. I know that some people will think what happened to us was just some kind of, maybe, a whale, but I'm here to tell you this was not a whale. Questions I still ask myself every day of what this could have been. The only thing I can conclude is that this was Leviathan himself. During Vietnam, I and 6 other men were on a squad night patrol, setting up our temporary camp. It was nighttime. I was nervous because it was pitch black. We were very limited on light, only having the stars above. I looked off in the distance, and I could see these huge eyes staring right at us. It was not moving or making any sound. I contacted my platoon sergeant, advised him of what it is. He told me to keep calm and keep an eye on it while he gets back to me. Some minutes later, he alerted me that there is supposed to be no enemy in the area, but he will send up flares to see if it's really what I was seeing. They warned they would only release 3 flares. It might not really be necessary. A couple of moments later, 3 flares popped up into the dark night sky, and I saw this creature was now only about 30 feet away. The eyes I saw in the distance were another one. There were multiple of them, and unbeknownst to us, they had begun moving closer in the darkness. They were about 8 to 9 feet tall, large heads, eyes that were glowing, just like stars. They also had 2 large antennae on top of their head, resembling some sort of insectoid. The body was like that of a man, but it kind of had scales and looked somewhat reptilian, as if burned and distorted by acid or fire. On its back, it had a small pair of wings, and on the end of its trunk, there were 2 very sharp-looking spikes and appendages, which kind of resembled horns. If there was ever a mantis man, this was it. It also had claws on all of its limbs. I could see it was holding something in its claws, as if it was about to swing, although I couldn't make out what it was. I froze, not believing what I was seeing, and it stood there watching me for about 5 minutes, just lingering, before disappearing back in the dark. The whole incident was maybe 10 to 15 minutes, and the next day my sergeant suggested that I should visit the commanding officer, the CO, to give him a better look of what I saw. So the CO asked me to sit down and draw a sketch of this creature. As I was drawing it, he looked horrified as if he himself had already seen the thing. When I finished drawing, he said to me, "Soldier, I want you to remember that day as if it was your last day on Earth. Try to punctuate every last detail." I did so, and afterwards he told me and looked very grieved. He just explained, "I want you to forget everything that happened that night. It would be for your own good." He dismissed me. I never told anybody about this incident until now. I thought nobody would believe me, so I just kept my mouth shut. I could not sleep the whole night. The next day, I went to a medic, told him how I was terrified by what I saw. He actually gave me a shot of something that knocked me out cold for 7 hours, but not really sleep. I never had any other incidents with this creature, but I have heard of stories from friends who served over there during Vietnam as well. They told me they were terrified by this creature, running away from it, but it had chased them and actually eaten several of other men. One of my friends explained to me how one of these creatures had jumped on their friends and drowned them in one of the rivers. It was like no other mantis or creature I've ever seen or heard of, even though I know there's all sorts of horrors that lie in the jungles. I'm still terrified even now as I recall this event, and still have problems sleeping at night. I would love to forget it, but if one day I pass away and enter into heaven, what will happen if I see this creature again? People have been asking me for a name for this creature, but nobody knows what to call it. For the time being, I will call it a manticore, because it reminded me of a mantis man. This is one of those experiences that I have that I've never really pre-told to anybody. It sounds like something out of a grade B horror movie. But it happened. 68 years old, retired Navy Commander David Fravor is now involved in civilian life, having worked for decades as an aviator with the United States Navy, and then later as a pilot for the USN Reserves. You may remember David Fravor as the guy who had led top-secret investigations of reports of unidentified flying objects. He's also achieved some notoriety back in December of 2017. He had spoke about his experience investigating a UFO while piloting an FA-18 multi-role fighter stationed aboard the aircraft carrier USS Nimitz in 2004 off the coast of San Diego, California. What I'm about to tell you has me reliving the incident all over again, because it's just too strange for words to adequately describe what happened that day while we were tracking an unidentified object with my instruments, but also unable to get a radar lock. I was baffled by what I was seeing on the radar. It had performance characteristics that were far beyond any known aircraft in the inventory of the United States, or any foreign nation for that matter. So, I have absolutely no idea what it was. It didn't show up on my radar, and it was able to accelerate, get very quick bursts of speed beyond the normal limits of normal aircraft, and was also able to turn very sharp angles at speeds I could not believe. I can't begin to guess how fast it moved. It looked like 1 second it was there, and the next second it was gone. As I mentioned earlier, my interest in UFOs did not start till later in my career. I'd say with this incident, it was peaked somewhat. The command of the USS Nimitz is based out of Coronado, California, with at least one aircraft carrier assigned to the base on most days of the week. Commander Fravor's role as commanding officer for any given expedition would be to pilot the FA-18, a multi-role fighter that can serve in various roles from air superiority or attack roles, and he has logged over 700 hours of flight time. Technically, Commander Fravor's rank during this incident would have been Lieutenant Commander, but for brevity, we'll just say 04. On November 14, 2004, USS Princeton oceanography expert Mr. Ray Keller had been tracking a mysterious object for over 2 weeks. He even called in the USS Nimitz to investigate what he was seeing with his own eyes, along with his instruments on board the ocean surveillance ship, the USNS Observation Island. According to Commander Fravor's recollection of the events, which began to unfold that day, he said this: "I was on a routine training mission flying out to an aircraft carrier off Point Loma in San Diego, when the oceanography officer asked if I could check something out with him. He wanted me to take a look at what his radar was showing. He said that there was something weird in the vicinity of the island San Clemente, down here. It showed up about 45 miles away. He gave me a vector, and I found it immediately on my radar too. I couldn't make heads or tails of it on my display, so I thought, okay, I'll go take a look and see if I can make it out visually. It was around 2,000 to 3,000 feet above the water, heading roughly south. The thing that whatever it was would turn very sharp and sort of come back on itself. Corkscrew turns. Eventually, we figured we'd never get a solid track on it, so we decided to make our way back towards the Nimitz, and as we got closer, my wingman made visual contact. He got within a few miles of the object, and I was probably 4 or 5 miles away from it. You could clearly see it, but what you could see was not like anything I'd seen before. The object was just hanging there in the air. We were at 25,000 feet, but I could clearly see the shape of it. It looked like a 45-degree angle cutout with a massive wingspan. It did not look like anything, an airplane or anything I've ever seen before flying over water, with no navigational lights. As we were moving in on it, it just disappeared. That was the end of that. It was at this time after he had returned to the Nimitz when Commander Fravor's superiors began asking him what he had encountered, and what his plans were to follow up on it. But, taking into account what they knew about the object, they ordered him to take no further action as I was leaving the tactical data that we were getting about it and began to disappear. So I thought this thing was moving very quickly away from me, which is why I wanted to get closer, but my superiors told me not to pursue. However, Commander Fravor's curiosity had been piqued, so when he got back to the Nimitz, he asked that they pull up any information on what he had just seen. They brought into the ready room for all the data that they had collected by looking at it with an infrared and radar, everything too, but there was nothing. It showed up in none of those displays. It was the shape of a 45-degree angle cutout, yet it had no propulsion system that we could see. There was no exhaust plume. According to Commander Fravor, by the time his superiors began to look into what he had encountered up close, whatever it was they were looking at had suddenly vanished. And by the time they looked back, it was close enough to them that what he had saw with his own eyes could not be denied. As we were preparing to get into debriefing, I asked other pilots who had been on missions before, and none of them had ever heard anything about this. But as we entered the room, there it was on the projector, the data I had seen myself. All of a sudden, it showed up 10 miles out, 15 miles out. All these waypoints along the track, all at the exact same angle. The object would also perform maneuvers that no known aircraft could possibly do, according to Commander Fravor. One example, including what he described as a vertical 180, in which the object changed course instantaneously and shot straight upwards, only to turn again and come right back down. It was almost like it knew we were watching it, or it was moving away from us. I'm not sure, but that's what makes me think it had some kind of intelligence. The other pilots watching the events unfold became terrified by what they were seeing take place. According to Commander Fravor, who admits that he too was now terrified about what they might be facing. Everyone in the room got a chill. We knew there was something really bad flying around us. And while it may not have been obvious to Commander Fravor and the other pilots what had terrified them so much, decades later, we know what they were seeing was something from beyond. In 1972, May 18th, off the coast of Thailand, our submarine, the USS Queenfish SS-399, a Sturgeon-class attack submarine, was on a routine patrol submerged in the Gulf of Thailand, when at about 2:15 p.m., we spotted an unidentified object coming from the surface. It rapidly became obvious that this was heading straight for our submerged position. There were no returns from any ship or aircraft in the area. The only thing we could see was a great disturbance of the water, and whatever it was headed directly for our position. Everybody standing topside in the conning tower and on the bridge grabbed their binoculars to get a closer look at this mysterious object. But what came into focus didn't make much sense. Someone hollered out that it looked like a giant octopus, and it did seem to be swimming using the many arms or legs, much the same way a giant squid propels itself. We couldn't tell which, but the part that made all of us terrified was the fact that it appeared intelligent, and so the way it moved. The large eyes seemed to be looking right at us, and its actions appeared deliberate as well as menacing. Almost as if this unearthly sea monster had reached our submarine, it rapidly swam by, but not before giving us all a very close look at its shiny, wet skin. The arms or legs seemed to be moving in unison, much like the oars of an ancient galley. The top fin or hump was about 10 feet tall, and the large eyes were situated roughly 6 feet apart on either side of this hump. The skin was smooth and it appeared to be very large, at least 100 feet in length. The flesh, or whatever seemed thick and white like the belly of a shark, but the skin on the tar part was blacker than any sea we'd ever seen. It looked very slimy. We could see no pectoral fins or flippers. As it swam past us all, everybody was terrified but also fascinated at the same time. For several seconds following, we watched this creature swim by very rapidly, and there was no doubt in our mind that our submarine, seeming to pause, looked directly at us before shooting off into the deep blue sea. We were terrified, not knowing what this was. It wasn't quite an octopus, and it did not look like a squid. It looked like something we had never seen before. Although terrified, we were fascinated by its size and beauty, We all knew that this creature was no whale, behemoth, or any known sea creature. I didn't think to be a living dinosaur either, but who could say for sure? Well, the captain surfaced the boat as fast as he could to warn any other ship or aircraft of the strange thing that had just happened. The radio room tried to contact any and all ships in the area. Nobody answered. We stayed on the surface for about an hour, trying to tell everybody that this large thing had appeared intelligent and that it had gone after our submarine just as if we were bothersome fish that had swum into its territory. The captain decided to track this creature on sonar, but soon found out our equipment was not capable of tracking anything that large. We could see the object on the screen about 6 feet tall and about 10 feet wide, but this was about all. After several days of tracking it, the captain determined this thing to be over 100 feet in length and very intelligent. It even seemed to sense our presence almost as quickly as we could run sonar on it. I count myself lucky to have seen it once, but after hearing other stories, I wish that I had never seen anything so terrifyingly beautiful. This was in 2003. We were in a helicopter on a rescue mission. We were going to land in this valley, right next to a large mountain, around 4,200 meters high. There was intelligence that the enemy was hiding out there, so naturally, they were our targets for being seen by us. When we got very close to the landing zone, this 200-long-meter cavern opened up under the helicopter's path. I was a gunner at the time, so I was one of the first ones to see this. It looked like a black hole, and it happened so fast that we could have been hit by accident if we weren't careful about our surroundings. Luckily, none of us died from it. There were supposed to be 5 enemy combatants in this cavern with their wives and kids. These things were anywhere between 7 to 9 feet tall, and certainly not enemy soldiers. They had greenish-yellow scaly skin, huge fangs, long claws, and looked like damn abominations from a Frankenstein monster. They also had webbed hands and claws. Our pilots saw this coming. We used our searchlights and lit up the cavern nicely before landing. They were pretty upset, or so they seemed, and immediately began chasing after the copter. The pilot tried taking off again, and we began shooting at these things. They screamed like demons, wanting to take down our chopper. And with all the gunfire going on, the helicopter began to spin out of control, nearly crashing. We had to battle these things for a good while, but we were finally able to kill them all. Using a combination of ammo and grenades, we lost several good men. We had to retreat on the mission to escape what was going on here. We were able to get a hold of a company and chopper came in for us about 3 hours later. Because we hid, we managed to stay alive. I don't know exactly how we managed to survive this, but we did. And it wasn't because of me so much as the other guys on my squad. They were the true heroes, to be sure. I just wanted to do my duty and help. This is what happened during the battle, though. It turns out that these things were an ancient breed of mutated humans who lived in the mountains long ago. There's reports of them being worshipped by ancient cults. This is what I've been told by other fellow veterans who have had their own stories with these creatures as well during this time in Afghanistan. There are even men during Desert Storm that talk about large humanoid beings who hide under the sand and who have attacked and devoured convoys whole. Pretty terrifying stuff out there in the desert. You can call me Zach. I won't reveal my real name. I served in the U.S. Marine Corps for at least 4 years, longer than it seems most people serve. I was stationed at the Military Entrance Processing Station in Bangor, Maine, while going through training to join an infantry unit. It's a tough job that requires a lot of stamina and endurance. It's also very stressful. You have to give up a lot of your personal freedom in exchange for discipline and structure. My time there was most dangerous. While I was stationed there, I witnessed several strange sightings that are still etched into my brain even today, after trying my best to forget them. The first sighting happening in the summer of 2009 when I was in the waiting room with my mother and brother. It was an unusually hot day. It felt like 110 degrees outside, even though it really wasn't all that hot. However, we were waiting for the bus to take us back to housing. We had been in there for about 2 hours now. Everybody in the station was miserable from the heat, and people were starting to lose their tempers for no reason. My mom reminded me of a cartoon character who was trying to keep her composure. She just couldn't stop herself from yelling. At first, I thought it was funny watching people get yelled at, but after a couple hours, it got really old, and I just wanted to leave. We were sitting near the front desk, talking with two soldiers who had heard our entire conversation, even though they were deep in their own, about some event that happened earlier in the day. The following is an account of what happened my mom told me that she saw at the desk. One of the soldiers was not saying much, but the second soldier was retelling his story excitedly. Apparently, he saw a pair of green eyes with a large black creature, also having wings near one of the bus stops. My mom said she thought it looked like something out of an old Japanese horror movie. Due to the description, it sounded suspiciously like a mythical creature called the Kappa. She said that it was about the size of a human, but had dark green scaly skin, long arms. It also had webbed feet and hands, kind of like it was pointing upwards. It was flying over the sky, almost motionless and gliding when the soldiers got off the bus, terrified. The soldier who saw it in question ran back toward the building to report his sighting of this creature, that he thought it was just some sort of anomaly at first. He kept saying that it was real, and at first I thought he was joking. But after a minute or two of talking about how he couldn't believe what he was seeing, both soldiers got horrified. They looked from the front door to the back door, realized it must have been looking at them from one of those windows, or had been watching them from the sky ceiling. One of them said that it looked into the sky and kind of just vanished, as if just completely disappearing, as if it kind of disintegrated into nothing. He was literally trembling in fear when he saw it, and the thought of drawing his gun on this thing was terrifying if it came back down on him after he went inside. They both had no idea what it was. They thought maybe it had been a genetic experiment or some sort of alien. One guy said he saw something similar when he was up in Alaska, and the other soldiers agreed that it must maybe be a sign from God, telling them to stay away from going outside while this thing is lurking around near them. When my mother told me what she saw, I said that it must have been a really strange animal that they probably haven't seen before. Most of the military bases in Maine are right next to very large forests, so maybe this thing isn't really a demon or an alien, and has always been here, but no one's ever noticed it. Maybe somebody went out into the woods and found it when they were doing something. I told her that I thought these soldiers were just messing with them, and she agreed, but said that they looked pretty scared enough to be telling the truth. One of them even sounded like he was going to cry as he described it, and its face. I know he may have been lying about it, but that was a pretty good performance if he was. He didn't say much about what it looked like, but he was pretty shaken up. Maybe there really is something out there. While training at Fort Carson one night, a Marine and his team were way out in the field when they noticed what appeared to be blood-red eyes on something very large and dark. The men instantaneously switched their flashlights from floodlight mode to beam mode, but this did little to decrease the size of the object, which now turned away from them at high speed, once it realized its attention was being drawn to. From that day on, anytime somebody mentioned or asked about coyotes in that area, they were told, no, not here, too big. The men reported about seeing large canine hybrid creatures, which is why it was such a shock. These creatures were 4 to 5 feet tall, had short red fur with large legs and paws. Their eyes were glowing red in the dark, and they moved very fast. According to the men's description, these creatures looked like a mix between a dog's and a coyote's, but were much larger than either of them, probably about twice as large. According to the military personnel who work at the base, they've been told there were no such hybrid animals in the area, although these men would never admit to seeing anything so strange. They wanted it known that these creatures do exist and could still be living on Fort Carson today. Other stories include of Marines getting attacked by these large creatures, which they say were very humanoid in nature, but were not human. One story comes from an ex-Marine who claimed that he was at a certain location with his commanding officer, and they heard a strange animal-like shriek. He said the creature was large, very fast, moving like a blur. The officer informed him to not worry about it and to not say a word. He said that many of his colleagues speak of these creatures in private, but refuse to talk about them when in the company of others, especially if they're higher-ups. This Marine claims that there have been sightings of these creatures on numerous occasions, and that they are very real. He is not the only one with stories like this either, as many Marines have had similar sightings and experiences, but refuse to speak up about them. In June of 2006, 4 of us were on a training mission north of Camp Lejeune, near the town of Jacksonville. We pulled off next to a field and all went down into the field, laid around for about an hour after taking in the sun, being out in the brush for most of the morning. There was nothing but woods as far as you could see, even behind us. No traffic, no sounds of really any kind. We didn't think too much about it since we were taking a break. There was a rise in the field that I had to stand up to look over. As soon as I stood up, I saw what looked like 2 black things laying down on the edge of the woodline, about 200 yards away. As soon as they saw me, they stood up and they started walking off at a brisk pace. I immediately drew my M4 carbine and told everybody else to stay low. I fired off 1 round towards them at their feet, which is what I was taught to do if you are trying to get somebody's attention. The 2 subjects immediately began sprinting towards the woods, which only made me now more nervous. I was taught that you don't run from somebody trying to contact you. After they disappeared, I told everybody else to stand up, and we all took off for our vehicles. We didn't say much after until we got back to base. The next day, we got together and talked about what had happened. We agreed that the subjects were both male, and they were both around 5'8" to 6. They ran like track athletes or soldiers do, not like lumbering large people who are overweight. One of the guys in our team was a good shot. We all decided that he would be the one who would shoot at the subject if we ever ran into them again. He's 6'2", around 215, and in good shape. The next time we went on a training mission, there was only 4 of us instead of 5, so somebody stayed behind. For some reason, we were out there for almost 3 days. We got back to camp on a Friday night, and everybody was eager to get home for the weekend. On Saturday, we all went down into town to eat. I didn't say much what about it happened, just that I felt uneasy being out there alone without a team. One of the guys in our team, let's call him Sam, was really freaked out by it, and did not want to ever go back into that field again. He told me he had heard moaning sounds coming from the woods while we were out there. When I asked him if he thought they could have been animals, he said no, that it was too loud and sounded like it came from 2 different people. I didn't really know what to say since I had only heard the sounds once when I stood up quickly, but never when laying down in the grass like we had. I had no idea he had heard them. Sam was convinced that there were people out there. He wanted me to tell the team leader about it. I told him that I would tell him about it the next time we went out on a training mission. He was really scared, so he wanted to go back and investigate further with me. I informed him no. About a week later, we were all at the team leader's house, waiting for him to get home from work, and I told them about what had happened. They laughed at first, but none of them had heard the moaning sounds or seen anything on their patrols. The team leader, let's call him Rich, told us that he did not want us to come back out there without a full team of people, just in case it was true. I agreed with him, and was glad that he felt that way. I can say that so far nothing has happened yet, but I'll let you know as soon as we do. Last note, I believe the 2 figures we saw were juvenile or adolescent Sasquatch, seemingly caught off guard. I was a Marine on military installation. I don't know why, but me and 2 of my friends decided to stay there overnight as we were shuttled from the barracks. I do remember it was late, maybe after 1:32 a.m. One of my buddies who had been out drinking, but not excessively. We had been told not to go outside, so we had to just walk around the inside, but had no contact with any of the other Marines. It was dark inside, so we were using our flashlights. I went to the bathroom, which was directly across from my room. When I came out, my buddies were not there. I began looking for them, but they seemed gone. I know it would be bad if they drank more and became belligerent. Suddenly, I saw a shadow move at the end of one hallway. Turning my light, I saw one of them hunkered down beside a trash can. He said he needed to go outside. He ate some food that didn't agree with him. He took off his pants and wiped himself with some paper towels. He was brains out. He cleaned himself up and walked toward me suddenly, and he realized he had no clothes on. This happened at the trash can where I saw the shadow move about 40 feet away from me, without saying anything to my friends who were caught with their pants down. I took off running toward the exit. As I got closer, I felt like somebody or something was following me. Fast footsteps behind me that sounded like they were wearing combat boots. How could anybody be walking around in boots that late at night? It made no sense. These heavy footfalls were definitely chasing after me. Now I began screaming bloody murder as I ran around the corner and around another one, triggering my friends, who, triggering their flashlights, saw me running like a maniac through the hallways. I thought I was going to die from fear. Well, maybe from fear and also from exhaustion. My two friends caught up with me when I finally stopped running. By this time, we had gotten separated from each other by about 100 or so yards. We didn't know where anything was, so we went back into our rooms and falling asleep. The next day, we were told that nobody else had gotten any sleep because of us making too much noise. Apparently, they heard us screaming but couldn't find us because it had got real dark outside due to lights being out ordered earlier that evening. We didn't tell anybody what had happened. It would have just gotten us into worse trouble. I think my friends said something to some of the other Marines after we got back, but nobody else saw or heard anything. This is the one of many terrifying experiences that I had during my time in the Marine Corps. I don't know if this is a ghost, demon, a bad dream, or what, but I do know what I saw and heard wasn't normal, and it definitely did not feel like an ordinary night. I'm sorry if this story is butchered. I'm a terrible writer, but I felt it important to get this story off my chest. Hopefully you could wade through my bad storytelling. September 1993. One night, several of my Marine Corps infantry platoons were doing some training exercises just outside of our base camp. As we all sat around the fire pit, right after dinner, one of my men looked out into the darkness, claiming to see a shadow moving in the trees only 50 feet away from us. He watched it for a while, before safely turning back and asking me if I had noticed anything strange myself. I had not. The next day, we came back and searched that area, looking for anything but found nothing unusual at all. However, on the third day, we went back. One of our members was walking along when he realized there was something behind him. He turned around quickly, only to find nobody was there. At this point, everybody had begun wondering what it could be. It couldn't be seen at all, but they could feel its presence. One night, later on after the previous events had taken place, I was walking around with one of my other Marines discussing how strange this thing was, when all of a sudden, we realized that whatever it was that was following us earlier had now begun to walk parallel with me. I dropped to one knee quickly and let loose 2 quick shots into the darkness, hoping to scare off whatever it was for good. But whatever it was didn't move or flinch. It just kept walking like nothing happened. At this point, none of us were too scared though, so any feelings of fright were now pushed back down below conscious thoughts as we walked back towards the main camp compound. We never could figure out what it was, but I still think about it once in a while. I hope one day we can solve the mystery surrounding this black apparition that walked with us on our training exercises, ever so silently. I was an infantry platoon leader in the U.S. Army at the time. My platoon and I were on a mission in Germany, somewhere around the junction of the Czech Republic-German border. We had been there for about 2 months, which is how long it took for our unit to transition from Iraq, where they trained Iraqi police officers, to Germany. We were patrolling the woods when we came to a clearing. I figured it would be a good place for my platoon to take a break from advancing through the dense forest. I went up ahead to scout out what was beyond that clearing. Something was troubling me about how quiet it seemed. Even the crickets and grass and birds were all quiet. There was nothing, But I figured it was my imagination after the long time spent moving forward without stopping at all. As soon as I turned around, though, they were all standing at attention behind me, their weapons pointing straight up in the air. They had obviously seen whatever that was startling them. And when I turned around, all I saw was the clearing that seemed to have no life in it whatsoever. So then I think maybe one of my squad leaders had probably seen something, maybe a deer or some other animal. So I asked them if they had just seen an animal. They all immediately deny seeing anything out of the ordinary and go back to taking their break. I was walking into the clearing to find where they had seen whatever it was that spooked them, and I had only walked about halfway across the open space when I hear everybody screaming over my radios. "Move out! Move out!" is all I heard. So then I start running toward where they are. But before I'm halfway there, I hear automatic weapons firing up ahead in our direction. And of course, being combat soldiers, they are trained to be constantly vigilant of their surroundings. So of course they are firing at anything moving in the woods around them, or taking cover behind trees or logs if nothing else is moving for them to shoot at. But then, there were multiple things moving that they could see. Everybody started yelling, "Enemy behind us," or "He's running toward you, to your right, flank." So everybody is firing in every direction. I finally get out there, and it turns out that my squad leader had seen one of these creatures run into the path, only 50 meters away. He saw it earlier than everybody else, but at first thought, it was maybe just another member of our platoon. He didn't see the face hidden behind an overgrown mane. But when I got out there, I knew exactly what had startled them. And it wasn't any kind of animal like a deer or elk, like I guessed. It was another type of creature, but neither me or anybody else could figure out exactly what it was, although I knew. I just didn't want to admit it. We never found any tracks to follow, or anything else that indicated there were more of these things around, although my entire platoon believes they were stalked by several of these things. So we figured this one man must have been a lone hunter or something and got spooked when he got caught between both groups. About a minute later, the woods seemed to come alive with every type of woodland creature you can imagine, scurrying from one side of the forest to another. It seems they were all trying to get out from underfoot, as either us or them passed through their environment. So maybe this was something. I'm not too sure. But I can tell you, I think it was a group of these things that were about to attack. And had my entire platoon not shot at these things, they probably would have pounced, tearing my men apart. I believe they were acting in self-defense. And I think they were fighting against these bipedal canine animals. July 1st, 2013. Ryan Coughlin and Special Ops team were training in the Adirondacks, an extensive mountain range north of New York City. The team was split into 3 groups of 2. This way, they could cover more ground and be far less noticeable. Ryan's group consisted of himself and a Navy SEAL named Mark Smithson, who was from the Naval Academy class of '93. They were on a recon mission at night, along with their squad leader, who was last seen 15 minutes prior to the event. I had just scratched my nose on my left arm as we walked when I saw what looked like something out of the movie Predator. It came into view on our right side, crawling through some thick brambles and brush, said Coughlin. It appeared to roll on its side, looking at us with its legs in the air for a moment, before turning and scampering off into the woods. It appeared to stand on 2 legs like a human when it stood up. Ryan Coughlin is currently an infantryman serving in the Army National Guard. He was deployed twice, once in Operation Enduring Freedom, Afghanistan, and once in Operation Iraqi Freedom. His military occupation specialty or job is heavy weapons infantryman. He's also graduated from Airborne School and is trained as a combat lifesaver. He's also an ex-sniper. Now, these creatures are said to be like brutes. These goatman hybrid creatures that are said to be ape-like, that are brutal, with scaly skin, and are reported to be about 7 feet tall. They have been known to kill animals in the forests of North America and drink their blood, ritualistically. These creatures are said to be extremely hostile and curious of humans, which contradicts Coughlin's encounter. Native Americans throughout the Northeast claim that this mythological creature is real, and they're actually known as Wendigos. There are even stories of tribes killing anybody who strays into the woods because they believe it gives them powers like these ancient gods. Wendigo psychosis, or Wendigo possession, was an alleged mental illness among certain Native American cultures, particularly a tribe living around Lake Superior in northern Minnesota. Wendigo, as described by those affected by the psychosis, include a general aversion to cannibalism and deviance from cultural norms such as intense cravings for human flesh and the compulsion to eat it. The legend of the Wendigo is said to have originated within the Algonquin tribes living in Canada and parts of present-day New England. The legend has since spread throughout most of North America. The earliest written account of Wendigo psychosis dates back to actually 1673, where it was first recorded by French Jesuit missionary Jean, who first learned about it from Wyandot natives living near Georgian Bay. According to some other researchers, there are two distinct versions of Wendigo, one that involves great violence or cannibalism, and a less violent version involving the fixation of a Wendigo upon a person. In this case, Ryan Coughlin was not attacked by the creature, but he saw it clear as day. This could be because they were most likely posed no threat to them, or perhaps these creatures are more curious than hostile. However, there are many instances where people who have encountered these creatures wound up missing or dead, or have their blood completely drained of their bodies. Like in most cryptid cases, we may never know what happened that night between Ryan and his special ops team, but it definitely left an impression on him he'll never forget. This report holds several critical eyewitness accounts of the events at O'Hare International Airport on October 4th in 1941. The following is an excerpt from a UAP report regarding this incident. The first military officer sighting. The first incident occurred at about 3:15 a.m. Two lieutenants observed a red light moving above the airport's northwest corner. As they watched, it descended below the level of the airport and disappeared from their view. Although this is a very credible sighting, there remains some doubt as to whether or not this was a UAP or something else entirely. The second military officer sighting. A little bit before 4 a.m., two other officers stationed at the field observed an object that looked like an automobile headlight traveling across the northwest section of the O'Hare Airport at approximately 2,000 feet, or 610 meters. The air traffic control tower reported seeing nothing on radar corresponding with this sighting. The description provided by the officers corresponds with that of a star or a planet. This sighting is far more credible than that of the first military officer, as it was visible on radar and was seen by multiple eyewitnesses. The third military officer sighting. At roughly 4:25 a.m., several enlisted men stationed at the airport reported seeing what they described as an unidentified object pass overhead traveling east to west at a very high velocity. This unknown object was also visible on radar and has recently been analyzed using recently declassified information from World War II archives. This sighting is definitely identified as a vehicle in low Earth orbit through its appearance, moving across the sky, and behavior on radar tracking systems, thus eliminating possible explanations such as a plane. As the object passed to the west, one of the witnesses reported hearing a screaming noise. This also was confirmed by several other witnesses who too saw it. Although it is unknown what exactly these onlookers heard, this could be explained as radio static caused by increased radiation from the testing of radar systems on a vehicle in low Earth orbit. There were no reports of any sound accompanying this mysterious vehicle as it traveled across the sky towards the horizon and out of sight. In summation, it is likely that there was some sort of atmospheric phenomenon which accounts for some aspects of these sightings, but not others. A declassified report shows that at this time, there were atomic tests being done above ground some near Las Vegas, Nevada, some 400 miles or 640 kilometers away. This could, in addition to the LED sighting, account for some of the atmospheric phenomenon reported by eyewitnesses. It is unlikely that this UFO incident was caused by atomic activity or extraterrestrial intervention, though It currently remains unexplained how weather patterns could have affected witnesses on the ground at O'Hare Airport. Throughout the winter of 1986, a certain ranger was riding his beat-up old snowmobile past a clearing in the deep woods of northern Wisconsin. It had just snowed, and there were many deer tracks all over the place. The ranger was patrolling this area because it had been getting hit by poachers more often than any other part of that forest. As he came to the edge of a small clearing, he noticed that one set of deer tracks led behind an old abandoned cabin at one corner of the clearing. The ranger later told me that he tried to convince himself to not go look around back there, but something kept pushing him to investigate further. He finally gave in, following those tracks until they disappeared under an upturned, broken 3-board fence, surrounding what looked like a small abandoned garden inside the clearing. It was very overgrown with grass and weeds, so the ranger couldn't see anything except for some broken pieces of wood on the ground, which seemed to indicate that this was indeed once a garden. Of course, this is how it normally would have looked, except it was winter, and there was a lot of snow on the ground. The ranger just stood there, perplexed about what would have made those deer tracks go under the fence. Then, just as he started to step inside the clearing, I jumped out of behind one of those huge pine trees right in front of him. It took him about 2 seconds to realize it was not a deer or another snowmobiler. The yellow eyes were glowing brightly at him through his trusty flashlight beam as he stared straight into its face from only 10 feet away. Instantaneously, his mind was yelling at him to run like hell, but his legs and feet were frozen in fear, just as frozen as everything around him was. And as he saw it start to lower its head and its upper body down like it was beginning to crouch on all fours, almost like it had been on all fours before this happened, the ranger's mind had finally snapped clear, back into reality, and began spinning around like a top for those few seconds. He was finally able to get back on his snowmobile. As soon as he sat down on the seat, he felt those skis underneath him. He shot out of the snow, and he could feel this creature give chase. His only thought then was getting out of there as fast as possible. The ranger did not look back until he reached the tree line, at least 200 yards away from where he had first seen this creature. By then, this being had lost him, had stopped following him altogether. When he turned to look, he looked at the clearing, but he couldn't see much through the trees. But he could make out glowing eyes looking out into the darkness of the forest behind him. They were kind of fading, but only shortly in the distance. The ranger returned to the main place 2 days later with another ranger by his side for some reason. Nothing was ever found there. No other signs of life, nobody having ever been out there. This was very strange, and was never actually reported on paper. What I believe the ranger saw was either a skinwalker or a wendigo that he had potentially stumbled upon, since if you talk to Native American tribes up there, those things are everywhere. Now, I don't think it was a skinwalker, but I do believe it could have been a wendigo, potentially hunting for its next victim. And had that park ranger not acted quickly, the ranger could have been his next victim or meal, depending on how you want to look at it, assuming the wendigo or skinwalker was going to feast upon him, or even worse, possess him to do its own wicked works using his body. Now, this is also not the first report that I've read about from people up here. This is not just from Forest Service personnel, but also military personnel as well. I've even read personal reports from some National Guard, who are up near the border of Michigan, right by Canada, encountering their own creatures, resembling a dead rotting deer carcass, as one of them would describe. I know that might seem a little creepypasta to you, but I'm telling you, these are pretty professional men and women. They don't have time for Reddit creepypasta stories or fake stuff. My conclusion is that these people are actually facing real-life demons, or black magic practitioners who have managed to shapeshift into these beings. But from what I do understand from these reports, a lot of these men and women are afraid to talk about it. They always try to keep it on the down low, and they really don't want their name getting out attached to it. After all, if even word gets out that your name is attached to a report that says you encountered a creature like this, or a wendigo or a skinwalker, it could potentially destroy any career that you've ever dreamed of. So it makes sense why they want to keep it so low. but from the sounds of it, we're dealing with supernatural entities here. Beings far beyond that surpass the physical realm. These things will not only haunt you, but possess you, and do far worse damage to you than you can ever imagine. It's no wonder that even trained professionals like these men and women are scared of them, who want nothing to do with them and run. It even seems that being trained and armed has nothing to do with it either, no matter how much weapon you're carrying around. These things aren't hurt by mortal weapons. I had one National Guard explain to me that one of these beings dematerialized right in front of him when he pointed his weapon at it, completely terrified that he was having an hallucination, or that he was borderline schizophrenic. They are very real. Please, when you're out in the woods, watch where you're going. And please, just because the woods exist, doesn't mean you always need to be out there. I was part of a military patrol convoy en route through eastern Tennessee on a routine training regiment when we came across some weird cries going throughout the wilderness. To be honest, it sounded like an animal of some kind that was being tortured to death. Its cries were horrendous. Now, I am far from a macho tough guy, but there's no way I'm leaving an animal suffering in pain for who knows how long if it's humanly possible to put the poor thing out of its misery. I took it upon myself to investigate. I talked with one of my squad mates about our options on the best way to get close enough to see what was going on, without spooking whatever might have made these noises, or catching any hostile attention. He agreed that keeping low and sticking as close as possible would be the smartest approach, since whoever or whatever was making these noises wasn't exactly close to the road we were patrolling. I was kind of surprised at how deep into the forest we had come, but orders were orders, and there was a mission to accomplish. Nobody wanted to do it any more than me, although none of us especially enjoyed being soldiers anyway, so it should have been no surprise that somebody raised their hand to volunteer for what I knew would be a crappy job by anybody's standards. The other soldier who volunteered with me was tough as nails, as well as being utterly fearless under fire, as you can expect from an ex-Marine. We made our way towards where those awful sounds seemed to be coming from, until the sobbing began. Now, things went from bad to worse, as we felt like we were being watched, in conjunction with all those noises. We never found a trace of the noises, but they kept persistently going on throughout the entire route of the convoy, like they moved along with the vehicle, which was a pretty unsettling feeling altogether. At some points during the travels, the screams would turn into this wailing, as if it was a woman being murdered, while other times, it would turn into the sound of a screaming cat, or even a goat or a rabbit, like it was about to die. Various animal noises it would change and go back and forth into. I don't know. I'm beginning to think after all that this wasn't an animal, that it was something trying to lure us out of the convoy. I've told this story to a few friends of mine, and while most of them are creeped out, some of them have their own speculations. Like one of my other friends. He's full-blooded Cherokee. He believes that what we had encountered that night was a skinwalker who was following us. I had to actually learn what a skinwalker is, and I'm not sure if skinwalkers are specific to Navajo or not. But either way, there are these beings who could shapeshift, and I'm thinking that's exactly what was happening that night. We were being followed by a witch that, for whatever reason, wanted us to leave the safety confines of our convoy and venture out just far enough by luring us with these cries of an animal before he or she could get us. Now, what their intentions were with us, I'm not sure, but it was very unsettling. Even making it 100 or so yards off the convoy, things felt dangerous, like we should retreat back to our safety zone. And even when we did, we didn't make it very far. We've done this route several times. This is the one and only time I've ever heard these noises. This is also the one and only time I've heard of these noises following us for the amount of miles it did, which is very disturbing in its own right. It just reinforces the belief that this certainly was something, and not just an animal crying in pain wanting to die. For if it was, the noises would have ceased eventually. But to follow us as many miles as it did, something was certainly wrong. Anyway, I'm writing this because I wanted to know your take on things. Could this certainly be a skinwalker, or some other sort of demonic being? Or was this actually maybe just an animal crying out for help? And maybe we just mistook the sounds for the way they were carrying out and reverberating throughout the wilderness. I'm still not sure, but I'd love to find out for sure. Before I became a teacher, I had a very short-lived career as a ranger. I'd grown up in a heavily forested area and had been an avid hiker and camper. It had seemed like it would be fun and a pretty easy job. Right after college, I got hired by the National Park Service and even had a brief placement in Utah before being relocated to Tennessee, specifically the Smoky Mountains. It was a beautiful area, and I was really looking forward to spending summertime there. Instead, I got the summer of hell. It began well enough. As a newbie, I was doing a ton of patrolling, routine safety checks, which was fine by me. I got to roam around the gigantic park, sometimes going hours without seeing anybody. A few weeks in, I got the first weird call. A family had reported animal tracks all around their site. It wasn't a big deal. All parks have some wildlife. But when I got there and saw what I saw, I clearly thought one of the other rangers was messing with me. That maybe it was a hazing thing for the newbie, me. There were tracks, but they were weird. They definitely were not canine or bear. They were human-shaped, but huge, with claws at the end. I checked out the area, took some pictures, and then helped the family get another campsite. I turned the pictures into my boss, expecting her to laugh and give up the joke. Instead, she was pretty angry. She thought I was the one playing the joke. I asked her to come out to the site with me, but by the time we did, the rain had washed away all prints. 2 weeks later, I get another phone call. This one was worse. The campsite had been completely trashed, tents shredded, everything nearly destroyed. Luckily, the campers had not been there at the time. This camp was in a very grassy area, so there weren't any footprints. But I did find some light brown tufts of fur on the ground. This time, my boss saw the destruction herself. She marked it in the books as a bear attack. The fur didn't resemble anything like a bear, though. It was much longer. Finally, in early August, I got a call about a lost pet. A young couple had been walking their dog, and it had slipped its collar off, taken off into the woods. They were devastated. A few of the other newer rangers and I got picked to head off into the woods to find the dog. We broke off into pairs, knowing that going too far off trail was dangerous. I was with Brian, a decent guy I had sort of become friends with the last few months. We walked for hours, doing our best to cover our area. We whistled and called out, but did not see any sign of the dog. There were 2 hours left of daylight, and we had not got any other pressing calls. We agreed to stay out until dark before going back to the parking lot. As the sun began setting, we turned around and made a beeline for the nearest trail. We still had maybe 20 minutes or so until we got to the trail, and then we would have yet another 15 minutes on the trail itself. We felt bad about not finding the dog, but there was nothing else we can do. Halfway to the trail, we began hearing the noises. Growling sounds, a low howl. The missing dog was a lab. Labs did not howl like that. No dog I've ever heard of does. We grabbed our bear spray, hoping it would work. It was almost dusk now, so inside the forest, it was getting quite difficult to see. We looked around, but could not identify any source of sounds. We kept walking, hoping to leave whatever it was far behind. At the same time, Brian and I noticed an odd-looking tree. It looked like it had been mauled. Huge scratch marks and missing branches. Not unlike what a bear will do. I pulled out my flashlight and looked around the base of the tree. There again were the huge footprints, and they were not a bear's. In fact, they were just like the ones I had seen months back, and they were huge, or human-like. Claws at the end, and very narrow. This time, though, somebody else was seeing them with me. Brian's eyes got pretty huge, and he began swearing. We were suddenly very aware that we were alone, and it was nearly dark. We were still far from help. We picked up our pace, going quickly as we could in the twilight. We kept hearing the crashing and grunting sounds, but kept moving. Twice, I saw a dark shape run past, but the trees made it impossible to see what it was. It was large, tall, which was concerning, to say the least. We were nearly running as we approached the trail, or where we thought the trail was. We had to be within yards of it when the creature came barreling out of the woods, crashing right into us. I had a glimpse of a dog-like face before it knocked me into Brian, and we both went tumbling down the slope together. We rolled for seconds before hitting a tree. I looked back up the hill to get a better look at what had come at us. Staring down at us with glowing eyes was a creature I only thought existed in people's nightmares. It continued to stare and growling as we locked eyes. I could clearly see drool dripping from its mouth, and this had me petrified. Brian was frozen too, staring at this animal. Dark matted fur, towering high above us, built like a beast. It easily could have been lifting weights. Finally, I snapped to and grabbed a large branch for a weapon. Brian and I limped out of the forest, bruised and sore. It was well past dark by the time we got to the parking lot. The other rangers were waiting for us. They were worried, asked why we were so late. Under the lights, they could see that we were totally scraped up, and we explained what had happened. Before they could even respond, I showed them the shallow claw marks on my shoulder, where this creature had hit me. I told them that it was some kind of upright wolf or dog. I had no idea how else to describe it to them. Even though I had Brian backing me up, nobody believed us. My boss was just angry at me, threatened to reassign me. So I quit. I'd had enough of whatever that thing was roaming in those woods. Coincidentally, that missing Labrador was never found, and I can't help but think that the animal that I had discovered that day had something to do with it. Two years ago, another ranger and myself found a giant pentagram in a small clearing of trees drawn on the ground, like 20 feet in diameter. Most of the trees surrounding it were locust and had black beads hanging from the thorns. We found it at night too, but clearly whatever took place was several days prior. Fast forward to last night. We see a car parked at the dead-end road near that area. I figure it's just people fishing, but we decide to go check, make sure it's not an illegal campsite. Well, we get down there and can't find them, so we begin walking to the shoreline, stumble upon two women sitting inside of another pentagram, holding hands and chanting. They had a blanket down and a bunch of books. There was also a piece of driftwood in it, where they made an altar out of various fruits and leaves. Made contact with them, and they kept insisting it looked weird, but they were just messing around. Mid-conversation, the woman grabs this green canvas bag, kept clutching it, while I try to figure out what exactly they're doing. I was pretty creeped out, but kind of decided they were just weirdos, and ultimately weren't harming anything. They admitted that they had been here before, and that site we found 2 years ago was indeed them. And told them to make sure they don't leave anything behind this time, and left. Still unsure exactly what they were doing. We figured it must have been some related to the eclipse last night. Who knows for sure? That wouldn't be my first experience or dabble into occult-related experiences being a park ranger. That stuff happens out here far more than you would think. Far more than you can ever imagine. For anonymity, I won't say exactly where this happened, but I will tell you this did occur somewhere in the Pacific Northwest. I was doing my usual patrols one night when I get radioed from one of my colleagues that suspects he's found 3 unmarked graves. Well, I come over, check it out with him, and it does indeed look like just like that. And it does appear to have 3 large holes that were dug recently and then covered up, just in the shape as you would digging a grave. The police came in and excavated these holes, and it turns out we were right. They were unmarked graves, but for who and why? Out here in the middle of nowhere, about 7 miles from the nearest hiking trail. It made no sense. The graves were pretty fresh, but the bodies in them were very badly decomposed, mostly bones. What's very disturbing about this story is that all 3 bodies exhumed from those graves were all very, very large men, 7 to 8 feet tall. No, these were not Bigfoot. These were clearly human skeletons, just 3 gargantuan-sized men, clearly decomposed. So we had all these questions. Where did these people come from? Why were they naked? There were no traces of any clothing. Why were they so badly decomposed, and who buried them? I can't remember if I told you already, but this was right around 85, 86. And the police and the coroner were all just as baffled as me and my colleague were. Easily one of the strangest finds I've ever had, even to this day. I work at quite a rural park in Massachusetts. We have a small nature trail that we have never really seen much pop up on before. However, the past few weeks has been different. 2 weeks ago, we got a report of a raccoon tail and entrails on the trail, something we have never heard of before. So, we went down, and right where the fork is in the trail, the only place that everybody would see, there is a pile of intestines in the middle of the left trail, and a severed raccoon tail in the middle of the right trail. Once we looked ahead, we found a raccoon head right at the start of the fork, staring straight out of the entrance. There was no blood, no bones, no anything. Just those parts. We went down a little bit and found a rock that had a bit of trash near it. Very unusual for our trail. It was the perfect rock to be able to sit on and be able to see the entrance of the trail without anybody seeing you. Right in front of the rock was a skeleton. So at least we found the rest of the raccoon, right? Wrong. This skeleton had its head intact, with its fur in a pile next to it. A different animal. We have had rangers on this site for years who have never seen a dead animal anywhere close to the trail. We just found 2. Since then, some other weird things have popped up. One in particular was a knife thrown into the middle of the overgrown area at the trail. The other of which looks like some type of pentagram logo drawn into the ground with a small square and triangle in it. We still have no clue why it was there.